Today I have 5 mostly Dollar Tree fall DIYs, so let's get started. I saw these owl MDF pieces in the crafting aisle, and I think these are out all year long, but I thought they were perfect for a fall sign. I knew I wanted to decoupage them, and faux leather accents are trending in home decor, so I grabbed some of my Dollar Tree faux leather in the cognac and black colors. Since this is a thicker material, I used my decoupage glue and put a generous coat on the owls, then added the leather and let that glue dry. Then cut off that excess material with my X-Acto knife. I'm going to put these on a sign and want them to pop a bit more, so I painted the edges in the opposite colors. The cognac ones I painted black, and then for the black one I had to mix up a color that was as close to the cognac as I could get it. When you mix paint colors, you don't want to use the brush to mix it, because when you go to paint the object, you will likely have that unmixed color pushed up into the bristles. So I've started using the handle of my paintbrush to mix. Next, I found this wood sign at Michael's in their clearance section for 75% off. I paid around $5 for it, which was such a great deal. So I removed that raised part with the words, which did rip off some of the paper, so I sanded that part down. The teal stripes don't really go with my vision for this, so I painted them black. Then for the center, I want it to feel more fall, and I have a ton of old scrapbook paper that was my grandfather's, and I found this greenery looking one that is perfect. So I cut it down and glued it to the center of the sign. Now I started out using my liquid patina, but this wasn't working so well. It was drying too quickly, causing areas of the paper not to stick down and then have bubbles. So on the second piece, I used decoupage glue, and that worked much better on this thick paper. However, once both sides dried fully, the liquid patina side actually normalized. It was really strange. Now to add the owls on, I added a Jenga block under each one of them to raise them off the surface a little bit, and then hot glued them down. I love how high-end yet simple this sign looks for fall. This project is nothing new, and I have tried coloring mason jars before on my channel, kind of unsuccessfully, so today I'm giving it another shot, and I love how these ones turned out. This time I'm only using Mod Podge and food coloring. I didn't add in any water, which I did the last time, so I mixed up a reddish brown color for the first jar. While doing some research for this, I saw a few people paint the Mod Podge on the jars, so I gave that a try and then stuck it in the oven to dry out quicker. I can tell you I don't like this method, but let me show you another way. For the next jar, I mixed up a green color, and this time I poured it into the jar and swirled it around to coat the inside. Since I didn't add any water this time, it worked so much better. And then I let the excess drip out for about an hour before putting it into the oven to dry. So here's how they both look, and I pulled the green one out early because the oven was causing the bubbles to show too much, so it's only half dry. And the brown one showed all of those brush strokes. I also wanted them to be a little bit darker, so the good thing about this being Mod Podge is you can easily just pull that glue off the sides and start over if you don't like the result. This time I added in double the amount of food coloring. I will say you need more than you think you need, but play around with it and experiment. I also didn't put them in the oven this time and let them air dry. That helped prevent bubbles and the uneven coloring from drying too quickly, but it takes about 24 hours. Once they were dried, I printed out a pumpkin line art to put on one of the jars, and I put the paper inside and used a Sharpie to trace over those lines, and that's it for this one. You guys, I have been trying to get my hands on these pumpkin wreath forms for years. So this year I went to the Dollar Tree every Friday and every Saturday starting in the middle of July to make sure I got some. And finally I scored and picked up 2. Probably should have gotten more, but that's okay. This first one is Pinterest inspired, and I'm using 4mm macrame. When figuring out how much cord you need, measure the length of the piece, or the length you want your hanging to be. So for the pumpkin, I started with the spines, which measure between 13 and 15 inches, and then take that number and multiply it by 8. I always round up a little bit. Next, take the cord and fold it in half, and then tie it in a knot onto the pumpkin form. Then I tape the form down so it doesn't move around on me. I'm going to create the same knot over and over on this whole piece, This is called a cobra knot, and you take the right cord and make a backwards 4 over top of the wire. Then take the left cord and pull it on top of the straight portion of that backwards 4. And take the end of the left cord behind the wire and up through the middle of that backwards 4 and pull the cords tight. This really is an easy knot, and I know you guys can follow along too. Now you just repeat this over and over. You can also start with the left cord. That would just make your spiral go towards the right instead of the left. But either way, make sure you always start with the same side every time. After a few knots, I'm adding a bead, but I need to cut the form to do that. This type of wire cutter makes cutting these forms really easy. I have very weak hand strength and was able to cut this with ease. And I'm repeating this process now throughout all of the spines. Make a few knots, add a bead, make a few knots. Once you get to the cut portion, you want to glue and tape it back together. I had only glued it back together, but the tape is necessary because the glue was not holding after I got the knots complete and I couldn't go back in and fix it. After I finished all of the spines, there was some cord left and I don't want to cut those off and risk the knots unraveling, so I taped them to the edges. Then I went back around the edge of the pumpkin with the same knot. This time I needed 385 inches of the cord and did not add any more beads. Here you can see my wires started popping apart with the movement, and I had to keep gluing them back together, so if you do this, definitely tape those closed as well. I wanted to add something more to the pumpkin, so I grabbed this cocoa liner from Dollar Tree and cut it into sections that would fit behind the macrame. Then I wrapped macrame cord around a floral stem and it curled it for some detail. I also picked up these leather leaves from Dollar Tree and added one of those. For the second pumpkin wreath, I bought this chunky blanket yarn from Hobby Lobby and I'm weaving it through the whole wreath. I did cut long sections of the yarn to make it a little bit easier, so once I got to an end, I just glued the next strand right onto it, since this stuff is so fluffy you can't even tell. And at the top, I glued the yarn all along the edge. To embellish this one, I wanted to give plaster dipped flowers a try. I have been seeing this a lot all over my Pinterest feed and watched a few videos from other creators. All you need is plaster of Paris, water, and glue. I'm not sure if the glue is 100% necessary, but one of the videos I watched said this helps the plaster to stick. So the plaster says to mix 1 part water to 2 parts plaster. I did that for the first batch, but then used a little bit less plaster the second time, and I prefer it to be a little bit thinner. Plaster starts to set up pretty quickly, so you only want to mix what you can use in about 10 minutes or less. And I'm using a silicone bowl and spatula since you cannot put this stuff down your drain. Once it's hard, it's easy to get rid of right off of that silicone. Once everything is nice and mixed up, you can start dipping the flowers in. I'm using some of these dogwood flowers and dip them into the plaster. And then use my spatula to make sure it gets in between all of those petals as well. I found it's best to work with white flowers if you can. They are easier to cover in one coat. And then I hung the flowers on a line to dry over some wax paper. The second batch I did, I decided to paint on and see how that looked. So I used a sponge brush and applied the plaster to a fern stem. I prefer dipping into the plaster a little bit better. I think it turns out a little bit cleaner in the end. Plaster completely dries in about 30 minutes. I waited a few hours to be sure, and then I also dipped a few of the pieces a second time. Once everything was ready to go, I'm adding the pieces to the bottom of my pumpkin wreath. I just used hot glue, and I'm really not sure how long this would hold up for. I can't imagine it will last past one season, but it turned out really cute. This next project, I was really excited about my idea and couldn't believe I haven't seen anyone else make this, but if you have, please let me know in the comments. I saw this Dollar Tree terrarium just sitting on my table and thought that would be such a cute pumpkin. So I sanded it down a bit to rough up the surface and then gave it 2 coats of white paint. I'm going to use various apple barrel paints to make it look like a pumpkin. And I didn't film too much of the painting because I just kept playing around, layering the colors until I was happy with the way that it looked. So once I was happy with the paint, I'm taking a stem from another Dollar Tree pumpkin and hot glue it on top. I did go back and add some embellishments on top as well, but then I added in some rocks and succulents to make it a terrarium, and this little guy is complete.